begin at your convenience, introduce your topic, and move forward with your discussion that I'm looking forward to.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Arlene Bond, and I'm very grateful to have an opportunity to talk to you about my approach. I guess I have to say it's my approach to change management. And I've decided, well, I'm using a case study that I recently worked on, that I recently worked with a client on. But I wanted to share a little bit about myself, not to take very long at all, but I've been doing whatever we want to call change management for at least 25 years. And it started really with organizations. I worked for IBM, and I was in a role that helped organizations utilize or get real benefit from having new computer systems. So learning new software, bringing it up. So it was a natural understanding of how to help people adapt to something new, which evolved over these many 25 years as we've seen everybody bring up all these different methodologies and ways of doing things. It's turned into, I guess, something you would call change management. For me, it still is the same kind of thing. It's how can you help people do their work better, and whatever that takes. So I look at myself as a practitioner trying to get that done. Um, so this presentation is just my perspective on that. And I'd like to say in the beginning, change in my world is a verb, okay? It continuously happens. We are not coming in with any definitive final process. We're continuing to do this. So I want to talk a little bit about how I evaluate a requirement to do a change. And I hope I can do this well. This is my personal message coming from Socrates a million years ago, okay? The secret of change is to focus your energy on not fighting what you had, what the old is, but building on the new. And that's whenever I start a project or work with clients, that's the main focus that I have. Okay, so my client was the Office of Anti-Terrorism Assistance. This organization was created to respond to Benghazi, and it was to ensure that embassies and also the environments that support or surround an embassy were secure. So we developed, the United States created training programs to, well, created a program to actually assess the safety of a given environment around any embassy, and also determine how to best support their existing either military or law enforcement. So it wound up being that, because a lot of these environments didn't have military, was to train the law enforcement in that area to support anti-terrorism activities and to identify terrorist activities. So I was brought into this organization because they had just received some cuts, and they were getting ready to actually, they were focusing on where in the organization they could save money and costs and still maintain their work. So the organization, part of this particular organization, is training and development. So the training curriculum division was actually created to develop all of the training content, and devise the training courses based on the understanding of who the client was, who the partner nation is what they called them, the relationship they had with all of the foreign environments. So they would understand their requirements. You know, did they have any police force? Did they have any military? Were they prepared to handle guns? Did they understand how to survey a certain area? All of these different, did they understand how to deal with cyber issues? All of these things were to get to assess the environment that we're in, and they would develop training to support increasing those skills over a series of years, starting immediately with the training. So they developed that kind of training, and their vision was to transform themselves from their existing environment into a more really agile, they called it, environment, so they could adapt to an ever-increasing need for more understanding of what terrorist activities could happen and how quickly they could prepare a partner nation to respond. Okay. I will like to have this be interactive, so please don't feel like you can interrupt me if you have a question. But this is the client relationship that I was coming into. Okay, here's the opportunity that they were actually asking me to respond to. The statement of work really said they wanted me to design and implement strategic objectives that would ensure that they could transform to this agile, ISD-oriented training development environment from where they currently were. They were doing it. The reason that they were anxious to do it was because they had all of these reductions in congressional appropriations. They had cuts in their infrastructure budget, and they were also just really trying to determine what was best going to keep them running and operating most effectively. They had decided that one of the units within the training curriculum division could be changed or taken away, and they were going to incorporate the skills from what they called the content management unit. This was the unit where all the subject matter experts were, the people that understood specific law enforcement activities, treatments, and that were the advisors for how the training content should be delivered, or what should be delivered as training content. So they worked very closely with another group of ISD training developers to create the training, and the training developers, of course, would handle how the content was going to look, what kind of equipment would be necessary in order to continue the training, but all the things that were required to deliver this training, as well as the language that it needed to be in and the cultural issues that came up from it. So this is the kind of thing that they had to do this. And they wanted me to do this for them in 3 months with high-level cost-cutting recommendations that they could immediately implement. So you can imagine that this was probably a little overzealous, maybe, high level of anticipation. Anyway, moving right along on this. So the next thing is, so why was I so excited about this opportunity? Okay, well, there were several things that made this in my opinion, a great chance to work with a client. And one was because they were highly motivated to make a change. They were faced with the fact that they literally had to continue to operate. They had a great demand on them in terms of the type of service they provided, and they could not stop moving while they changed. So they were highly motivated to get somebody to help them figure it out, and they wanted to do something quickly. Leadership was fully engaged based on that, because the leader was a short-term time period, and this was his project. He wanted this to happen. The workforce, so resources were made available, and the workforce was willing to participate because they realized change was coming and they didn't know what was going to happen to them. So the more they felt like they could get understanding, they were anxious to understand what was going to happen. And the actual change that had to happen touched a great deal of the organization overall. So to me, this was an excellent opportunity to work with a client. Okay, so the approach I took: first, we had to manage expectations, and I was able to convince them that we had to extend the project at least 4 more months beyond what they had originally thought, because there was no way that we could even get to all of the workforce or even understand how to help them unless there was time to get it done. So they agreed to that. We also said, and when I say we, it was me, and it was an ISD subject matter expert. So the two of us were the project team for this. So the next thing that we wanted to know was, what does success mean to you? What do we actually need to find out? What would you be willing to do that would say, yes, we are successfully incorporating these two organizations together and we're getting the right result? So we had a lot of discussions around that with the executive leadership and also all levels of leadership to find out what was going on. And then another thing was to get a commitment from them to ensure that when we decided, or when we got agreement and validation on what we were going to focus on, that they would give us resources. They would allow us to create project teams, which we call work groups in this situation, to accomplish the objectives that needed to be done in order to make this transition happen. So the initial part of my approach to the thing was to do a discovery. Our discovery included hundreds of interviews, really, but we focused on first the content program managers, which were the people that actually were the subject matter experts, to understand what they did, what was their job, what actual responsibilities did they have, and how did they work with other parts of the organization to get their job done. So we documented that. We also spoke with all of the ISD specialists. They were also trying to understand what kind of responsibilities they would have to take over, and they were in the support role, so they weren't used to taking the lead on the training. They were used to following the direction from the subject matter experts. So we had this kind of mental, oh my God, you want me to lead this thing now kind of issue as well. Talked to a lot of the executives, and then the organizations that supported the completion of the work they did, which was, how were they going to execute the training, deliver it to the country that it had to go to, ensure that they had all of the contracting support and equipment and delivery of materials and everything in place, which meant that the financial management process had to be understood in terms of how they accomplished that, because until they had the money allocated, they couldn't deliver, they couldn't take any other action. So with that kind of understanding, we had to spend time understanding that. So we analyzed a lot of that. We looked specifically, and I'll show you with some of the tools I used, we looked specifically at how the content managers and the ISD specialists work together. What was their business process? How did they share information? When did they share information? What were they actually accomplishing together? And when did it get passed over from one to the other to continue on? So we had a lot of understanding about that. Once again, that for me is documenting how the business process works. And I'll talk a little more about that anyway. Once we determined what we felt were what the workforce believed were critical objectives to accomplishing this transition, and also to supporting some of the real problems that they were having in terms of how they did their work anyway, we brought these to the leadership to have a discussion about how we were going to proceed. Any questions so far? Am I that captivating? I can't believe it. Okay, I'm going to move on. All right. So,
very clear.
Okay. Just feel free whenever you want. All right, now, analyzing the organization. Okay, this is the product of all of the interviews and the interactions with all of the people in the organization. What we learned were, one, leadership rotated out about every 2 years. So that meant the highest levels of leadership and decision-making in the organization were people whose career path was taking them on this rotation, and this was one of their responsibilities, kind of thing. So clearly, and this happens a lot in military, at least in my experience, you're going to have leadership that has to make a big impact in a very short amount of time. And, they're coming into an organization they may or may not know anything about, but they're going to fix it immediately and move on to their next challenge. So you have an organization approach, they're used to this kind of leadership, and they protect themselves. They usually figure out a way to avoid anything that's going to drastically impact their ability to function while they appease the leadership until they leave, basically. So, or they get a good relationship with leadership and they actually accomplish some productive things. But at any rate, their support will usually leave before they really complete it, or it'll change hands before they really complete it. So it really depends on where things stand. So that's another real driver for motivating to get something done in a short period of time. The organization was also very, very stovepipe, which over time I was able to learn a lot more about, because they were really an organization that did training, development, and delivery. The entire organization, that was their purpose. But they had divided themselves up with one part of the organization that focused on the partner nation relationship, so the customer, if you will. What does a territory look like? What kind of training do they need? They were, experienced because they had either worked in embassies or they had managed the embassy organization. They would handle that. And so they were considered leaders, and they were brought in to manage only the customer relationship. Then you had the training development organization that I was working with, who actually created the training and answered the requirements that were needed to support that. And then there was a third organization that actually delivered the training. They were the ones who managed the equipment in warehouses. They made sure that the correct instructors were involved, because of course you had to have instructors of all kinds to do any kind of training who also spoke many different languages. So there were a lot of issues with clearing instructors, making sure they were available, a bunch of things like that. So that was a whole separate organization. So they had divided this one process into 3 separate pieces. And when any organization stovepipes in that manner, especially if they're really talking about one deliverable, which is this training, execution, effective execution of a training product, they create barriers and issues for themselves just trying to get the job done. Somebody doesn't understand what somebody else is doing, or a decision didn't get made, so I can't move this document forward. A lot of issues. So anyway, that was a barrier to them. So communication was not really effective. Culturally, they were created to respond to crisis. So the nature of the organization was crisis oriented. They were going to react. Everything was a high priority. Everything had to be done immediately. And it really created unbelievable stress for this workforce, who was completely dedicated to making sure the mission got done and would do anything to have this. They worked a lot in teams because they needed a lot of resources and understanding a lot of different aspects in order to make sure the training happened. So they collaborated frequently, but depending on how well somebody was trained in their job, it depended on how many problems they might have and things that they'd have to deal with. They also trained people internally in the organization almost on a one-on-one basis. So literally you were lucky, and they hoped that they could get somebody in to replace somebody who was leaving, so they could be trained by the person they were replacing, because it wasn't documented well what they were actually going to have to do. And I call these people one-whos. Okay, so they're people who are very expert at whatever they had responsibility for. They knew exactly how to get it done, but when they were missing, no one else could do it. They were the one who got it done. They were the one. You go to them, their work would literally stack up because no one else understood enough about it to be effective at it. So that was also another issue. And also the way they did learn was they would fix mistakes a lot. Oh, well, if you'd only asked me, I would have told you, and you wouldn't have made that mistake. So this was how people learned. So with this kind of motivation, and the leader that they had in place at the time that I was working for had less than a year left. He had only been there a year, and he had less than a year left to be there. We had a lot of decision making from a stovepipe perspective is done without considering how it affects the rest of the organization, especially when you're in a continuous business process. So there were a lot of issues that caused contention between the different organizations. And also, we knew that they were very, very concerned about maintaining the standard of performance that they already had with their training. They are known worldwide as the gold standard for anti-terrorist curriculum development and training. So they were very concerned about ensuring that was maintained. Okay. So let me see, am I going through this? Okay, yes. So, and just still analyzing the problem, the curriculum development process was such that a lot of it was done internally. They determined what needed to be done, but frequently they hired contractors who had more current information or techniques to actually deliver a lot of the training, or even to help write some of the course material, which was a great deal of expense to them. And internally, they had a lot of internal knowledge and people who could really handle that better. And so this was something we were considering. And also, let's see, well, they had decided that they were going to make this radical change in how the organization looked. They were getting rid of the content management unit, and they had not told anybody that they were going to do that. So there was literally nothing but rumors flying around about what in the world was going to happen, how it was going to happen. The leader, I found out later, had never even done an all hands meeting to introduce himself. Okay, so they had no idea what was going to happen to them. And what he had done in his defense, in some ways, we worked through this, but what he had done in his defense was he had told his executive staff what his plans were and expected them to explain it. So explain basically, here's what's going to happen to you, but we don't know how, and we don't know why, and we don't know when. So it was a very tenuous and very stressful situation for the workforce and everything coming into this problem. Okay. So this is what I understood going in. This is why I was able to at least get them to focus on extending the project timeline. What I used as tools to find out about how the organization worked, this is one of my main processes that I like to use with all organizations. And before I begin this part, is there any question about what I've said so far? Because I'm kind of going into the technical piece of it. So
One question, Arlene. To what extent was the worldwide placement and people maybe dispersed as an issue, or are you mainly working with people in Washington?
You mean were we influencing the?
Yeah, were the people that were involved worldwide or primarily just there in Washington?
They were the training organization, so they were in Washington, but they had direct relationships with every embassy and all of the leadership in the embassy.
Okay.
That was also their, those were the people that came into this organization and continued to work. You know, they were the leadership that got transferred in and around. So is that the question?
Arlene, it's Gary. Just want to know, up to this point, have you been into the project for about a month, 2 months?
About 1 month at this point. About 1 month when I had this much understanding about what was going on. We still hadn't figured out the problem yet. We still hadn't finalized what we were going to do. But yeah, it was about a month. So you can imagine that was pretty frantic time. But for me, that's the way I like to work. So it was great. A lot of this was good because I was able to, kind of work the way I do it. So anyway, any other questions?
Arlene?
Yeah.
One of your earlier slides noted that you were excited because people, the workers wanted to help you, but you also noted more recently that there were a lot of rumors flying and people were under a lot of stress because they had no idea what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to understand. So, were they relieved when you came in? Was that and started asking these questions to make that understanding, or because I find that sometimes when things are like that, I get a lot of resistance. Like anything, they're under so much stress that any sort of thought of change or brings a lot of resistance. That's my question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there was huge resistance. And in my opinion, the resistance was basically fear. Okay, they didn't know what was going to happen to them. The place was hemorrhaging people because they had no idea what was going to happen. So initially, they were freaked out. Were they happy to see me? Absolutely not. But my discussion with them, and this is where it kind of ties into where I want to go right now, was about the business process. Okay. So the rumors are going around that the content management people knew because of discussions with their leadership that they were going to go at some point, but it had not been determined when. And they also knew that they were going to, they were being required to help transfer skill to the ISD part of the organization. So they knew they were tasked with that. That's really all they understood at the time. The ISD side, once again, they were more support oriented, knew that they were going to be taking over this responsibility, and they were, absolutely going to be held accountable for the training. Now, the people that were really good at this training and the leadership and everything, they were prepared for this because they were they were always the ones that really knew what was needed. And there was contention from time to time with the subject matter experts because some of their methodology and understanding might not have been as current as what the ISC people knew. So they were kind of happy that they were going to have a little more control over what happened. But we spent a lot of time discussing the actual business process. Now, from my experience, when I'm dealing with resistance and people having issues with things, you absolutely know they have every right to be angry. They've been through something, and I don't even know what they've been through, but I'm sure it was enough to, to justify how they feel, whatever it is. But what I need from them is to understand what they do. Okay, so I don't have time to spend worrying about the fear or anything. So I kind of redirect attention. And my focus of redirecting attention is, how do you do what you do? Let's look at deliverables that you have, for instance. The initial part of a training course, the content manager was going to produce the requirements for that training. He was going to say, hey, we're going to teach guarding a border. So we need people to understand how to manage that, the peripheral, how to handle
Should be
weapons,
working
how
now.
to identify. I'm sorry? Is someone speaking to me? Okay. But how to identify the situation. So these things would be what the content manager would then give to the ISD person, who would then develop the training and add all of the required policy issues and things like that the training needed in order to be viable. So they would do that kind of work. So the understanding was, who's doing what when? How does this process work? What's the step that you're on? Well, initially I'm going to get a requirement from a program manager that says we need training in this country that guards the border. So I'm then going to, as a subject matter expert, I'm going to go and analyze this environment and also what might be the most effective type of training based on my understanding of this partner nation. I'm going to then pass that on to the ISD person and say, here's the content that they need to be taught. Please structure it so that it's a training class. And they would then work that part out. And then the last part is, how do we get it delivered? We need weapons. We need, the right instructors. We need a bunch of things in a certain country at this particular time to conduct this training. That was the other part of the organization. So we would understand all of the documents that had to be created and managed and the relationships to get that done. So that was the beginning process. As you can see, when you analyze a business process step, if I start with looking at the top part here, well, the beginning, what initiates the step? Is it a decision? Is it an actual output? Do you get a request made? Is there something you have to do? What binds that? Well, what is the step that you're doing? What binds the step? Are there policies, laws, rules that you have to obey to accomplish it? Are there certain people with certain skills that you have to speak to and get information from before you can finish it? Those are the things. Below, you're understanding, who are those people? Also, what technical systems do you use? If it's a workflow that several other people are involved with, what workflow is it? What are they actually going to be doing? What decision are you waiting for them to give you? So you're understanding that. And then, are there any other additional tools? The output of that would be, what do you do now? What product is created? Where does it go from here? Okay. And the questions that I have listed here are just a general bunch. It really is tailored around who you're talking to and what you need to know. And it will come down to this part, okay, which would be the next thing. You're looking at, as I said, the high level process of what you're doing and how it's bound and who's involved and what you create. And there actually may be a step may actually decompose into several other steps that creates another product that would come up and be a part of the very next step. Point being, you're analyzing it and you come out of it understanding all of these things. At the end of this, I'm going to show you just one example of it. I have to wait till this because I don't know enough about how to use this tool to switch between them. So bear with me on that. Any questions about what I'm talking about right now before I move to the next thing? Okay.
Yeah, Arlene, I've got one question.
Yes.
When you're going through the process,
you mentioned deliverables. Do you look at this in terms of tangible and intangible deliverables?
I look at it as tangible deliverables because the
Okay.
intangible deliverables generally are the thing that supports a tangible deliverable. So if you
Yeah, okay.
if you need to interact with somebody, if you need to get a decision made, if you need to collaborate in some way or write something down or something, the intangibles there are going to either contribute or distract from the actual deliverable that you're creating.
Yeah, hence my reason for asking, because I found that the intangibles, because they're not recorded in the formal processes, their time factors and the inherent costs across different measures are never really understood, whether it's in resources or whatever. And I just wondered if you also looked at that.
Yeah, well, we actually do that. And part of the way that is at least addressed or made, or we become aware of it, let me say that, because it depends on what you want to do about it. But
Yeah.
the way you become aware of it is you start timing how long it takes to do something. If you actually need, if in their case especially, they had to plan in great detail because it takes a lot to execute a training program with weapons and all of this complicated stuff in a foreign country in a different language. There's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
So, and in order for them to do any of that, they had to have certain documentation accurately prepared. They had to determine who they were going to use for their instructors, how much equipment cost them, who they were paying for, what vendors they were hiring to provide whatever it needed to be done, in another country, how these relationships were going, who was in charge of it. All of these things were individual products that had to be in place in order for the next step to happen. So to me, that's a tangible deliverable.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And that's why I raised the intangible, because when working with similar organizations, we found that the amount of energy expended into the intangibles was actually creating many dysfunctions. I just wondered if you had the same experience.
Yeah, you don't want to, I mean, it's like you're picking on people. I want you to be good at your job. I'm not going to tell you what color pants to wear. So my emphasis with people is how do you do this the best? What's the best that you can do on this? What are the things that make it the best? So that people understand what good is and what bad is. You're not comparing who did good and who does bad. But if you're going to do this process successfully, here's what it takes, and here's the amount of time, and here's the decisions you need made in order for you to do it correctly. So you have a tangible thing that you can return back to and say, this is the step I was on. Here's who I spoke to. Here's what had to happen. Here's the result I got. Nobody's going to argue with that. It has nothing to do with whether, they like you as a human being or not. So we remove a lot of the stuff that people, I don't know, this is the methodology issue I have. Okay, methodology would say before I even got this far, in less than a month, I should have spent that whole month analyzing stakeholders and writing a document that showed stakeholder relationships or something like that. Irrelevant here, okay? Completely irrelevant here, and would piss them off. I wouldn't get anything done. So, we're in the process, and we're also understanding what good is more than anything else. And, that's basically people kind of hold their own selves accountable for good behavior if they're not afraid that somebody is either against them or trying to find out something to point out their bad behavior or their bad capability or something like that. If they don't feel threatened, if it's really about how should this be done well, then you have a whole different commitment to getting something done. I'm no longer afraid that you're firing me. I now want to show you what I think really good things are and what problems I'm honestly having with trying to get that done. Because that's the bigger issue. If you're going to solve a problem, solve my real problem. I'll commit to you for that. But if you're going to tell me how to cross my arms another way from the way I did before, I'm walking away. I got real work going on. So,
that wasn't my intention. It was just identifying other activities that aren't recorded elsewhere.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I go too far in explanation? No, I was just trying to explain the relationship with that Did I answer your question at all? Let me say that.
I think we may be talking about different things, but I don't want to hold it up. We can come back to that later.
Okay. Yeah, and maybe you can tell me then what the untangibles in your mind are, and maybe we can talk about it from that perspective.
Yeah, later on when you get into the discussion.
Okay. Right.
Arlene, sorry, can I just pop in for a quick question? This is
Oh,
Asha
please.
here. I am looking at the process and what you're talking about, and I find that it is very, very similar to what a project manager would do. So I just wanted to understand that how do you see yourself being different from a project manager versus a change manager or a change agent here?
Well, let me just say this. There is no difference. Okay, there never has been and there never will be. There are just people who spent their time learning one thing separately from the other. This is a project. I'm managing it. I'm managing how the change part of it happens, how the adaptation happens. I'm managing everything about it so we can achieve the result, or so that I can get to a point where I feel like they will move forward with it and they believe in what they're doing. So there is no separation. The only thing that I've ever seen a project management separation come from is when the project is technical, when they're installing software or something like that, because managing a software installation is a different kind of project. Not that people managing the user community is not actively involved, but you talk about it in whatever terms people are comfortable with in order to get the job done. But I'm still doing the same work. I may not be, the one making sure the software is installed correctly, but I'm certainly going to want to know when it's installed and how people plan to use it and how I can help them understand how their business process is going to change so they can adapt to it quickly. That's the change management in my mind, part of that.
Right.
Does that answer the question at all?
Yeah, it does in a way, because I was just trying to look at it in a way that, that the project management is more like an organizational wide, and whereas the change manager is more like a person, like where it impacts a person in making that difference of where you were to where you're going to be. And whereas the overarching, what you're explaining is, in my mind, more like a project management, but not a question, just an observation, just trying to understand.
I'm hoping. I appreciate that question. Like I said, this is my perspective. It works for me, but it's really helpful to understand whether it makes any sense to anybody else. I appreciate your question very much. Okay, so you understand how we're having a conversation about this. Let me just also mention that when I'm doing this kind of thing, and I'll show you a product later on, we're literally talking to a group of people who work that process. Okay, so they're not people outside of the process. They're people who work the process who are actually saying, yes, when I'm doing this step, I must have these people involved. I must have this information. I access this system to move the step forward. But they're talking about how the process works. The unique thing usually is they've never spoken to each other about how the process works. So there's a great deal of interchange of understanding that happens, because we're now talking about why I create this document and pass it on to you and what you do with it when you get it. I may have never thought about that before, but now I understand. I also may understand how to make it better for you, or you also may now understand how to ask me for what you really need, because you didn't understand what I was able to do. So it's a consciousness as a group or a team to accomplish a specific output, and everybody has a group understanding of how that's done and where they participate. Okay, any other questions about this part? Now, the next thing that happened in here, and I'm not going to go through a lot because clearly to talk about this, it was quite complicated and there's a lot of information here, but I want to show you some of the output and documents that I had. When we discovered what we actually wanted to talk about in terms of objectives, and that would be this list of things over here, we got agreement with leadership, but these were the areas we were going to focus on to complete this task of helping them do this transformation. So you see that we're talking about the transformation. We got agreement from them that they were the most important things to do. We even got agreement from them on what order they wanted, what priority they felt they were. So clearly, this initial one is transfer the program management role to the ISD project manager. That was obviously the very first and most important thing. We also went through and set up project teams to focus on these areas to make sure there was emphasis on it. It was separate enough so the right people were focused. So there were project management, there were content project management people and ISD people involved with integrating this part of the organization and also what the business processes would look like when that role happened. So across the top of here, we had who is the workforce? You know, are they there and what have they done? What are the initial activities? And this, we updated leadership, executive leadership on a weekly basis on this. So this was one of the week's examples, but this was the dashboard that we updated them on. As we updated them, we discussed any issues that came up, any changes in what we discovered, what we wanted focused on, and some things did change as we went along. But you can see this was the kind of progress we made on that. We created every working group had an actual template that they filled out that was their project plan. Okay, so yes, project planning directly involved. What it had was one of the items on it. It had individual completed project plan. It had a work group identified, specific people that were the best fit for that particular position. They also had, we had ownership, you know, who was going to manage this from a leadership perspective and make sure any decisions or resources or whatever was needed to move forward would be handled. So there was an owner for that. And then once the process was completed, who was going to own the actual process leadership wise, because, you know, people would still be doing the work. We had to manage and mitigate risk. We had to understand, you know, what was going to work and not work. What would we really want to make sure we understood? And everything had to be listed out and it wasn't agreed to, and there was a plan to mitigate. Okay, we also had implementation milestones because it was very critical to keep people focused. My perspective was I was leaving after this document and this process was complete and agreed to. We had several meetings, so they were moving forward and all of the groups were active. But I was going to leave and they had to continue. So I had to know they owned this. So a lot of this was to make sure they were comfortable with communicating with each other that way, and also that they would own it to the result, because I wasn't sure how long it was going to take for them to really finish. So we did that. And one of the biggest things that this all was about was bringing the development and ownership of the curriculum development in-house. So the ISD group was going to have all of this responsibility. So we really spent a lot of time clearing that up and making sure it was clear. This was also a very critical piece of the critical success factor of the project plan. They had to understand clearly who was affected, what role was going to be affected by the change and involved. Once again, it's kind of the way you talk about stakeholders. What was the relationship that were going to be impacted by this and needed to have it? Were there any specific communications that had to happen, or any kind of timeline of communications that needed to happen in order to keep people engaged? What tools would be used to do the work and also to continue to support that? And then would there be any training required at the end after the solution was complete? Okay, all of this were things that one had leadership, executive ownership of, workforce, which then became, of course, if you want to call it, change champions. They were actually creating the change. They wanted to be sure things were working well. So they were totally committed. And there was an end result, and they had to hold each other accountable to finish this. And I did leave and they did finish it, and they did ask me to come back to do other things. So it did work out that way. So the actual results, here were the results that came out of this. From an implementation perspective, we saved them over $6 million in actual removement of personnel, and then also the development of new processes to do. We redesigned how they develop business processes. Also added in things like their ability to gain new skills and new people with skills. We created two things. One, in order for them to replace content management, we devised a database and worked on a process with them so that they had relationships with other government organizations like the FBI, the CIA, NSA, which were all focused on these kinds of things. So there were experts in there that knew things about cyber training or certain kinds of guns or any of these things. And in some cases, they had worked with them to develop training. So what we did was we devised a way that the ISD people who had already been working with some of these other content people could talk to them and develop a relationship that would allow their organization to make them available to ATA to work on a specific training. And in return, they would give them something of value to them. They would either let them participate in the training, which would allow that organization to get some internal skill, or they would put their name on the training so they would get mutual credit, but they would do something. And in the database, there would be an understanding of what that relationship was. So when that resource came up again, or when the need for that resource came up again, the ISD people would at least have a beginning point to say, let's talk to, these people. Here's what we did with them previously. And, they would go back and start the relationship again. So they developed that. We also had them look at the colleges for graduate programs for ISD personnel so that they could bring in some people for internships and actually start internally growing the skill they needed to continue to do this. And so it was an ongoing process. And basically, they continued on to finish this, and that ISD program now is really actively done. There is no more content management. They have relationships with everybody. This was implemented in 2016, and they are very good at it now. So I guess that's it for what I have to say. Let me see if I can get out of here real quick, and then I can just show. Let's see. Let me show you. This is an example of an actual business process map. Okay, so when we have discussions, this is how we get. This particular map is a collaboration. It's a meeting that has to be had before any change can be made.
I'm not seeing it, Arlene.
You can't see it?
I've got a black screen.
Oh, okay, I don't know.
Me too.
Oh, all right. Well, let me see. I don't know if I can. I know why. Unfortunately, because this is, let me see if I can get another version of it. This is written in Visio. So apparently the system isn't supporting Visio right now. But hold on one sec. Let me see. It will let me get. Okay. Lots of things in the way here. I've got to have one. Let's see.
You might just try sharing your desktop instead of the application, see if that works.
Okay. Well, I thought that's what I was doing. But let's see. I was looking for one that was in a PDF format, which would be easy to show. Or I hope easier to show. Let me see.
It looks like you're sharing a white screen.
Okay, let's see. I think what I have to do, I think I figured it out. I have to reshare.
Yeah, you were sharing an application now versus that you might have to share the desktop and then pull it up.
Okay. Okay, sorry about this, but okay, this is it. Okay, it's only letting me share content, so I'm going to do that. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay. This is an example. Let me see which one. Okay, it's the same one I wanted to show you. Good. This is an example of a business process when it's been documented. This particular business process is a collaboration between 3 separate organizations. This would be the manager of all content. These people print and collaborate the document. The logistics, which is people who ship all equipment, store and handle it, and the program management team. So they would call, what you're seeing here is, these are the groups that had to come. The meeting was called at the beginning point here by the program manager of this organization. He's going to be collaborating about the details of the partner nation, training requirements, talking to a specific person from the training staff in order to understand what that is, the guidance for delivery of the training, and they'll be using a template that's on their workforce system to do that. These are all of the information that's required to make sure they're prepared for that meeting. The next step, collaboration. The person, this is the manager of translation and program transportation. He's coming prepared to discuss what's needed for language requirements, printing, shipping, everything related to that. So he's coming prepared to talk about that. He will be working with the rest of these people to do that. The next step is the procurement and logistics organization. They make sure that all equipment requirements are handled. So they come prepared to discuss or to show information about that. They're in the meeting, and after this discussion has happened, they do a follow-up. So they answer any additional questions that are required, and they make sure, and this once again is being led by another person, well, a person that worked in conjunction with this person to start the meeting, to continue on with this, and this is to get it through the system and to actually make sure the change has been made. Then it goes into the financial system over here for approval. That's what this part is. And continued on. I'm sorry, I can't see behind there. It's got, but anyway, this is an example of it. So as we're discussing this is what I'm discussing with a group of people that are directly involved with this to make sure all of this is actually accurate. Are there any questions about this? Any feedback? Well, okay. That was basically the only other thing that I wanted to talk about on this, but I am open to any questions you might have about anything.
One question is kind of a general, working with the federal government. Oftentimes there's many cases where the technology is out of date.
Always.
Uh,
Almost always.
okay, did you run into problems with that, and how did you have to deal with that?
Almost always out of date. The first thing usually is to find out if they're ever going to change it. If not, the second thing is to try to help them use it as optimally as possible in order to do the work that they have to do. Usually they're not using it very well, or it is so old that they literally have to do things, several steps. But they're the only ones who can explain what they have to do and how they do it. I can then work with them on, hopefully improving how they do it. So, any other questions on this? Did I take
Yeah,
up a lot
Arlene,
of time?
it's Gary. I looked at your process map, and just like you, done a lot of process mapping. The term that's kind of being used now for process mapping is called work as imagined.
Okay.
So we're now looking at work as done. So this is where you go back a few years later, and then you kind of go like, okay, are you guys still following the process work as done? And they'll probably go like, oh no, because the technology is old. We use these spreadsheets on the side. This is these are the workarounds here. So we've kind of like looked at, well, instead of a process map, if we did a decision map, and then you can tell me what the sort of decisions you had to make and the information you had or didn't have here, would it look the same as your process map? It's always surprising that they do not look the same at all.
Well, what we include in there are the actual decisions required. So it's not just a process map, which unfortunately, because of education, God bless them, they taught people to understand process only technically and not how people interact with a process, other than the stakeholder does. But the truth is, the only reason for a process is because people are working together in a certain way, and that's what we're talking about. So yeah, you can show it any way that makes sense for people to interact and say, yes, that's truly what I do. Or yes, this is a decision that has to be made here in order for us to take the next step. That's really what we're trying to discuss. And it needs to be in simple enough language that I don't have to teach them business process redesign so we can talk about it.
Yeah.
They have to be able to talk to it. They have to be able to take a map and explain something to someone else. So my goal is to make it as simple as possible.
Arlene, if I can link in.
Wait a minute, Gary, just to answer the other question you had, I forgot that because that's really an important point you were bringing up in terms of how things change over time. My intention is that, yes, it's going to change over time. There is nothing frozen in time about any change. Organizations evolve all the time. The change in technology will radically change how a business process works. That's usually the point. It's going to, like, just say, for example, when I got to them, they were using workflow software to, keep people working on a particular deliverable that had to be done, decisions being made and so forth. Each one of those had to be developed individually by a person who said, if we had workflow, this would be easier to do. So somebody figured out how to use it and they created this workflow and people participated in it. When the person left, nobody knew where the workflow went. They had no idea. So another one got created because all of a sudden the workflow's gone. Why did that happen? So they created a new one. What we wound up doing was saying, here's the reason you have the workflow in the first place. It needs to be created to be used continuously by everybody who has to do this step. So it needs to be maintained by your technical people, and it needs to be considered a public usable application that must be used for this reason. So you explain, this workflow is used when you want to create a financial document to give to the management organization to create this result. You would then initiate that workflow. Hopefully, it would either tell you what people should be involved or those people would already be connected, and it would just go from there. But these are things that if you don't understand how people do work, you would never be able to figure it out. And yes, they will continue to change. When I came back, because they asked me to come back and do other document development, I developed their training programs for all of the other organizations, which is how we kind of got them to work together and understand what they were doing better. But besides that, when I came back, it was 2 years later. I came back in 2018. They had implemented it. Not everything we recommended, they figured it out, but they definitely had implemented the complete change and it was working for them and they were happy with the results. I can't ask for better than that. Any other, did I answer your question?
Yep, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay. Arlene, during this time period, was there a change in management at all?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
How did you navigate that change?
Well, fortunately, I was there when I left the first time. There was one manager in place. When I came back, the manager of TCD, the actual organization, had gone, and the leadership of the whole organization had completely changed. So I had to re-meet him, explain why. Well, they had asked me there then to start developing these workbooks so that each of the people, a whole different reason, but someday, if you want me to, I'll talk about that another day. But anyway, they had asked me to come back for a reason. So I explained to him what I had been there for, what had already happened, and basically discussed what I was hoping to do to get, feedback from him if there were any issues with it. And he pretty much agreed with what I wanted to do. And at the very end of what I was doing in this particular project, I always do an overview with with the executive leadership, explaining what happened, who was involved, how they helped out, what we came up as a final recommendation, that kind of thing, and also as a ploy of saying, do you want me to keep going or are we done? So, so that's what that happened. You just continue to work with leadership. They have the same issues no matter what. They're there, they're brand new, they have no idea what's going on. I know more about their organization than they do coming into that situation. So I'm sensitive to the fact that they care about that they want to learn those things. So my goal always is to help a leader really feel like they understand that they're making a good decision based on the understanding of the problem. Okay, so this is why we need to do this. I clearly understand it's important, and I can tell you why. So I'm always trying to work with leadership for that, and I'm always trying to work with the workforce to help them explain it that way. Make sure that they're explaining an issue to leadership, the understanding of what they think a good solution is and why they think it's going to help, so they can get support. So it's an ongoing coaching kind of thing as well as all the other stuff.
A question's come in on the chat line asking how you computed the $6 million cost savings.
Okay, a large percentage of that was the elimination of the division, okay, in terms of the salaries and workforce work. And then also we redesigned business processes to eliminate several areas that had high cost activities that didn't need to happen. Like they brought a lot of the work in-house, so they stopped paying contractors large amounts of money to help development, those kind of things.
So Arlene, those were projected costs, right? Like because you left giving them a plan and they owned it and they ran with it. So when you came back, or was it an evaluation after, say, they implemented it to see whether those numbers were accurate in terms of, how they were measuring? Did they have to
No,
bring back anybody in just for, short-term contracts and things like that?
no. They
So how,
they did work out ways of working with people, but not the way they had been. And no, they didn't remeasure to see how much progress was made, because nothing is frozen in time that way. They had used some of the ideas, and some of the things were they were altered based on circumstances and what made more sense. So, but the idea was they determined what a better solution would be, and they did do that instead. As far as I'm concerned, that's a goal. That's that's all you ever hope will happen. So, yeah, it continued on. But two things: one, they wanted to see me again. Two, they told me in no uncertain terms they were very happy with what they had done. And three, they trusted me to continue to do some more with it for another 2 years. I developed several organizations within their material and these process maps. They're very excited to use them. They use them a lot. So once again, though, this is the client that I was working with, and this solution, this situation worked for them. Okay, so I'm not ever saying that this is the only way anything happens, but my idea of spending time, one, understanding the culture, understanding what they think a problem is, and validating whether in fact that is a problem in an organization that I'm going into, those I would consider our constant steps I always do. Everything else is a tool, and it's based on, what we need to find out at a given time. Like one of the organizations that I work with, they're trying to help them develop training materials. They had several people who literally were doing the exact same thing for different reasons. And it was conflicting with the actual result they wanted to have. And they didn't know that was happening. So I had to bring in a table where we literally had to talk about who had what kinds of responsibility. So who had responsibility to complete a task? Who was supposed to be informed about that task? Who was going to contribute information so the task could get done? And who only need to know when it was finished? So we had like I created a little formatted table so they could talk about that and to help them understand, oh, wow, we don't need all these people doing this. This is ridiculous. Get rid of that. They're the only ones that need to do that. They completely cleared out their own process. But it was necessary to help that particular situation get clearer. So, would I do that everywhere? It might not be relevant everywhere, but it was there. Okay, I think I'm taking up more time than I thought.
For me, it's not taking up time, it's using it, and it's very, very valuable. The process diagram you showed is very much the same style as most that I've seen. Some are more complex than others. You seem to show the basic spine, if you like, and the other processes coming into that spine. And then your last comment just now about people saying, well, hey, why are you doing this? We don't need you to do that, and so forth. This comes into what I was talking about earlier, this tangible and intangible deliverables.
Okay.
In my experience, that even with these wonderful process maps, when you actually look at what they really do day to day as individuals, there's a big gap between the two. And it's identifying why that gap is there. And so that's what I was referring to. What is mandated in the process in terms of what they have to deliver at each stage of the process, and what isn't mandated but they actually need in order to complete their mandated work. And that's the intangible stuff. It's knowledge from somebody else because they don't have it, or someone's got to make a decision but it's not shown here, and so on.
So that's what we do show in that process map.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
the critical part of it.
And so if you can cope with the shock, and if Ross allows me to do a screen share, I'll show you another version of a process map going through the process of identifying those tangible and intangible that I use. You may have heard of it. It's the Werner Allais approach, which is literally getting the key people in the process in the same room and getting them to walk through their process diagrammatically and explaining how they interact and react with each other. And the conversations usually are quite amazing because some people didn't even know others were in the process. And so the map, the sort of map that comes up, is the screen share okay there, Ross?
Yeah, Reg, you have screen sharing now?
Okay, let me click on and see what happens. Okay, share screen. And then if I come to this one, can you see the pictures?
Yep.
Yeah. The one on the left is just an expansion of part on the right. This is a classic process map at its early stage of how it really is undertaken before we get into the niceties of the one that you showed, which is it's sort of an outcome later. And the dotted lines on here, they're the intangibles. And on this particular one, there are lots of them. And the different colors are different parts of the organization involved in this process. And in this particular case, and I can't go into the customer at the moment because it's confidential, but to the right-hand side of the process map, they didn't even know those people were involved in the process.
What is an intangible? What exactly, can you say an actual intangible?
Yeah. It's knowledge, it's information from other sources, it's seeking permission to do something even though it's not shown in the process map. It's not something they're mandated to do in the process. So if they have to, for example, make a box, that's a tangible deliverable. They've got to make this box. But the knowledge how to do it is intangible. And if they have that knowledge, that's okay. But if they need to get somebody else to give them that knowledge, tell them, they phone them because they're not sure how to do something, then that's intangible. It takes time. It's not catered for in the costing of the process, in the manpower allocations and so forth. So the intangible things are very, very important to find out because they're the things where we get waste and cost. Yeah,
absolutely. And that I don't know if you noticed it clearly, but that's exactly what's going on in the business process we use. It's just hopefully a little bit easier to understand by
Yeah.
people when I'm not in the room. You know,
Yeah.
I need them to be able to explain it, not me. So, so I spend a lot of time making sure that what we are discussing, because, you know, I'm never concerned about how they spend their entire workday. What we're talking about is how do you get this done?
Yeah.
How do you
Yeah.
get this thing done? Okay, so all of our effort and understanding is around getting a good result of that particular thing. Whatever you
Yeah.
else you do with your day is your business. But when you're doing this step, you're coming in the room knowing what you need to bring into a situation to get that done. So,
We're talking in terms of similar things. It's just the terminology is slightly different. And I think the process is actually very different. This is just another way of doing it, is actually physically mapping each activity that they undertake. And you'll see that it's actually, you identify very quickly, for example, this function here on the left, when that person's not there, the whole system collapses.
oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and things like this.
Would you not call that a one who? Because see, I would call that a one who. That's the one
Yeah.
who does that. When they're not there, that doesn't get done.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so we're talking the same thing. It's just
Yeah, yeah.
that's why I asked the question to see whether the deliverables and intangible and tangible deliverables are part of the process that you went through. And it wasn't clear for me from the presentation. That's why I asked the question. And this is why, yeah.
So I'm curious, in both your facilitation, do you start with the end and work backwards? So in
No.
Arlene's case, you start with, okay, what is the result that you want? And then you work the next step. Well, how do you get that? Because when I've done decision maps, that's what we kind of do. It's kind of like, that's when you find out, like, well, we can't do that because the one who is not there, or we need the one who here. And you kind of work yourself, like, it's kind of like road mapping, doing a linear roadmap for project management. You kind of know where the future state end is, then you work backwards to the front. Just curious if that's the way you.
No. This particular, if I give you this particular one, this is a software bug or issue at a customer, and from the receipt of the information that that bug is there, what route do you take in order to resolve it? Okay, and this is the route for a simple bug in a software.
Interesting. So you're talking about it from the developer's perspective?
No, we start from the customer and work through the organization how it's resolved, if it is resolved. Yeah, and this person here, this owner as you call it, or 1.0, this person decides whether it's a patch, a rework, or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're talking about software development, software support.
Software support in an industrial context is part of a big machine.
Yeah. It's all kind of the same thing no matter what. You're literally saying this doesn't work. And then that request goes into a system and somebody within that environment understands what it means when you say that doesn't work. And they're the ones that help solve that problem.
Yeah.
And if they're the only one who has that skill, then that doesn't get solved until they're available.
Yeah, but even before then, the information you need to get to that point, because of the complexity of the system, could take anything up to 20 iterations, going back to the customer for more information. And so these are the sorts of things that you find out. And so I just wanted to check that what you're doing is similar to what I do. We may use different methodology, that's no problem. It's how we approach it. And that's why I asked the question.
Yeah, I agree. I do think, we are doing the same thing or similar things. Thank you for showing the car.
I'm trying to find a way to get rid of my screen. That's my toy. That's a boy's toy.
Yeah, I kind of think so.
Ross, can you take it back? the moment I can't find how I can get my share screen off.
You just stop your screen sharing, Reg. I think
Yeah, now I found it. No, it was
Exactly.
hiding. Now, where are we?
yeah, just
Here it goes. That's it. We're back to normal now.
So this is Fanny Carvalho. I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Um, so I see your process maps there is quite complex, and Arlene was mentioning something that resonated with me, which was I want them to be able to read the process map and to go from there when I'm not in the room. So I just wanted to share that something that I've used a lot when doing process mapping is stepwise refinement in different levels of abstraction so that when they look, they don't always have to look at the whole thing full of details. They can look at it in different levels of abstraction where they have just a few bubbles to deal with. And then, okay, I want to go deeper into this bubble. All right, so let's go there. Do you guys use that kind of thing?
When I have the opportunity to do it in software, yes, because you can go step by step and dig down into it and show it that way. We do map it out like that, but they're individual sheets usually because I don't have the software available to share with an organization, so I have to print it. Ideally, that would be the best way for them to have training for the future and training of that process internally.
Yeah, I do the same with desktop diagrams. When you're doing industrial design, you do that. Each level is different, and the lowest level is the full process.
What I do is when I usually don't have a specific software to do that. So when I'm going to present it to them, my findings, what I do is I just use PowerPoint and I do it in different levels of abstraction so that they can follow. So okay, let's go deeper into this bubble, and then I put that in the right-hand corner, upper right-hand corner, so that they know in the whole process where we are. I find that is a lot easier for them to follow. Otherwise, my experience is if I show them a really big complex map, they're going to start playing Where's Wally? Okay, where am I in this thing?
Yeah.
My little thing, and they lose track of what I'm trying to show them, which is how can we improve this process?
Yeah.
So in terms of the process mapping, this is what I have experienced, that I've used Kaizen.
Okay.
And I think what we are talking about here, when you have this huge amount of, dotted lines and maps flowing, it's when you're actually doing the brainstorming, right? Like trying to figure out, okay, where the issue is in, what are our touch points and who's responsible and what is it that we've thought about, we've not thought about, with certain limited amount of people in the room. And then
Yeah.
you take the finding and then the presentation, probably what, you do it either on a PowerPoint or in a quick short presentation of a Visio. That's my understanding. And again, open to, any feedback on that.
Yeah, I would say that's kind of how we would do it. The only difference is, well, at least in this case, okay, because this is a unique environment in itself and the way they work and everything, and it might not represent other types of organizations, but they did a lot of collaborating, okay? So they were, if you were looking at it from a software perspective, they were using a lot of workflow programs to actually support their activities with each other. But the point was they had to interact to accomplish the final result of whatever the process was. Now, we looked at major deliverables that affected their ability to complete their delivery of training, okay, the whole execution of it. So those were things like they needed to really be clear about what the content was going to be. They needed to be really clear that the course was developed correctly, that the course was translated in the language required, that it was going to be shipped on time, that they had an accurate, a good instructor available that could speak the language correctly and explain the training well. All of these individual things were activities that required them to collaborate in some way to make sure that result came out. Okay, so if I brought all of that together to say, here's how the large, big process works. Yeah, they in their workbooks, it was done that way just to freak them out. But for them to understand it and use it, it was by this deliverable. I need to be sure that the training instructors are vetted accurately, are the right people for the job and are on site. There's a document that we fill out that makes sure somebody validates all those things. Is that ready?
Arlene, is there the risk of showing one part that people will be polarized on their part rather than understanding their role in the whole process? Because I find increasingly people aren't very aware of complete processes and therefore have no sympathy or empathy for the whole. They just focus on their part, and that creates problems in itself. And so even
That's
though it
why-
may look maybe complex and messy at first, it's understanding where they sit in that mess is very important to understand.
Oh yeah,
You,
that's
you
why
know,
we do the process we do. So they can sit down in the room, everyone that's involved in creating whatever that deliverable is. Okay, the initial group of people, they're in the room. We're talking about how to do that successfully, and have we documented it correctly? And have we considered all the things you consider when you're doing this? So they sometimes are meeting each other for the first time. There's sometimes very first time they ever understood what happened after they gave off whatever they did to the next step. They had no idea, but now they know. And it's a different level of respect, and they're usually not. I mean, if I do this well, let me just say it. If I do this well, the way I intend to, there is no politics included. It's really, I'm trying to explain this. I want to validate it. I want to know for sure that this is accurate, because you're clearly going to show it to my boss. And I'm in this room. So, I want you to say that I was contributing. Or, I want to make sure my problem is documented. So you get people to participate from that perspective, but you remove the idea, absolutely, is to try the best to remove the politics. They're not relevant to how a business process works.
Absolutely agree.
you know, in my experience, what I've seen is sometimes you do have to get all the details. And at some point you have to get all the details always. That's what I was trying to say. And doing it bottom up is okay too. But when I come and I want to show them, this is how you guys communicate. This is how the work that you do communicate with the work that that person does. Then you kind of have to do it in different levels of abstraction so that they understand. People a lot of times they work in silos, and
Yeah,
they don't even know what kind of information they exchange with the other silo. So
exactly.
what I sometimes do is map all the details, and then I bring it up to a different level of abstraction so they can get a bird's eye view on what kind of information they exchange.
Hmm. The bottom line is, I agree with all of that. If it gets you to the conclusion you're trying to get to when you're doing this work, if you get them to make a change that effectively helps them, or if they are able to communicate better as a result, whatever the project outcome is supposed to be, if the tool you use gets you to engage the organization and get to the output that you want to get to, it's the best possible way to do it, period. And they all are somewhat different because you're dealing with different people, different situations. So, and I may try several things or at least think about using several things until I figure out what might really help whatever I'm trying to do at the time.
I agree. We need to have a lot of tools in our tool belt and use them as needed. I agree.
Okay, well, before we go any further, I did want to say thank you so much for listening to me on this. This is a great opportunity for me to talk about some of the work I do the way I do it. Since I interrupt so often in these conversations with my perspective, I was hoping this would share a little more about my perspective. So I appreciate you listening to that.
Now, thank you very much, Arlene. We're near the end. We really appreciate your insights and your years of experience. Any other last questions before we wrap up today?
Okay, as a young person in this, how much time do you spend, do you think, on process mapping compared to like the whole? Is that like because I've been part of process mapping before, and it can take quite a bit of, it's very intense, right? It takes a lot of time. But as once you do that, like how much of the pie is that ish? I know there's no one right answer.
Well, I could talk about the work I did with this particular project. And in this case, because I was under such a time crunch, the actual initial documentation of the process probably took a month. And we went through and probably documented about 30 processes that were critical to training delivery based on, the variables I was dealing with. So we're talking about 20 of them. And it took about a month to do that. But I had dedicated resources. Okay. They met on time when I needed them to meet, and we got things done in steps. So I didn't have, and that's a very unique opportunity. Usually, you don't always get your meetings when you need them and people cooperating or the right people in the room at the right time. But in this case, I was very fortunate for that. So it took about a month to get the processes we were going to talk about as far as this change was concerned. I didn't do the entire organization because at that time, first, I didn't have time to talk to the entire organization. And we were really within this one unit, within this one division, we had to make sure that the content managers could go away and that the ISD organization could support the continuation of training development. So that was the ultimate goal there. So everything I did was to make sure we had a clear understanding of them getting to that goal. So, and once again, my experience, and I've seen this over the years, a lot of the amount of time that the development and training takes, depending on the size of the organization, is really based on getting paid for a deliverable, far more than it is on how long it takes to actually find out the answer. So, if you're creating a document that shows business processes, you're going to spend a lot of time making sure you've got a great document that shows all the business processes. If you're trying to share an understanding of a business process so you can get people to do another step, you may not spend that much time creating a business process document. In my case, it would have been a waste, like I said, a waste of my time to develop a stakeholder management document or to spend time doing a communication plan for them, even though that's an expected deliverable from a change management project. It would have been irrelevant here. But did they need to understand when they needed to communicate and what they were communicating about and who the audience was going to be and who the actual communicator was? Yes. In the plan for the projects they were doing, those things were clearly mapped out because they were critical.
Okay, we've reached the end of our time. Thank you very much, Arlene. Appreciate it. We can continue the discussion online at your convenience. If any other questions come up, Reg, any concluding comments? And Reg, if you and Fanny could stick around a little bit afterwards, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank Arlene. What you've done is very brave, and you've done it for me extremely clearly. There was no doubt in how you've approached this and the strength behind it and your success. So thank you very much.
No, you're welcome. Thank you for the chance to do it. I love this group. You guys bring such great insight in and so many different perspectives. It's really helpful.